we'll move along pretty quickly. So the first common mistake that we see is poor corporate housekeeping, which is probably on my plate more. What I would say in that regard is when you start raising money from other people that aren't, mom, dad, brother, best friend, you need to make sure that your corporate house is in order. And if you do things wrong, it's sometimes hard to fix them. And you should always be thinking about the next stage of investment. And that includes if you've already, I've talked to a client recently who's done a very successful Series A, and we're doing some follow-up items. It's like, but we have to be thinking about the next stage is either an exit round or a very sophisticated institutional investor. So you got to keep your corporate house in order. It's other people's money. And the other thing I'd say is it's easier to keep your corporate house in order if you keep it simple. There will be some things that you read about. You can find all sorts of complex securities to offer, all sorts of complex arrangements to enter into with investors. And if you have to, or if there's a good strategic reason to do it, that's fine. But otherwise, keep it simple, follow a path that others have followed. That's probably it on that one. The second one, I think probably mine as well, overcomplicating the company or the offering structure. Again, there are lots of different ways to structure things. There are a smaller number of recognized, accepted structures. And if you find yourself getting outside of what I'll call market, think about whether there's a reason for you to be outside of market. Because if you're doing something dramatically different than others have done, including others who might be your future investors, they're going to ask about that. And they may be troubled by that. And they may ask you to unwind that or go back and cram something down on a prior investor or an employee or who it might be. So there's no need. Obviously, you've heard from us, there's lots of complicated terminology that we're using and some complicated structure. But you'll find once you start reading about it and understanding it better, it's not as complicated, and the folks that you'll be dealing with, particularly institutional investors, will understand it. It's when you try and overcomplicate it, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
Chris, do you have any advice as far as how you know what's not complicated and who you should talk with in order to get some of that advice?
Sure. First thing I would say is if your team is not experienced in this area, your expanded team includes your consultants, whether it's your CPA or your investment banker or your outsourced kind of business consultant or your lawyer. Those folks, you want those folks who have done this before, to have been through this stage before. Because you do find people that are very smart people that haven't done this before, might be negotiating terms or fighting about things or setting things up that are either irrelevant or not the most important items. So the other thing I would say is there are some pretty well accepted forms that you can find on the internet. For example, the National Venture Capital Association forms are right there and available. I don't know that they have a glossary, but they try and define the terms, and they try and add some commentary as to what this provision does, because those are legal documents, and so they're a little hefty. They're pretty meaty, but that's the way I would look at it. Next item is prior round mistakes. I bet we can both kind of comment on that. Did you want to take that one first?
Sure. This relates a little bit back to knowing the journey that you're on. You can get a little upside down by giving the wrong preferences early on, giving things away to investors early on that the next round of investors are not going to be excited about and want changed. You can agree to terms, overall terms in maybe your seed round or your A round that you just wanted the money, but the next investor doesn't like the deal. So that causes a lot of cleanup, and sometimes it can kill the next investor wanting to come in.
And that's kind of the business terms of the offering, which I think are the most important. The other thing, and I'm not going to get very deep into the securities law and compliance weeds here, but for most of your early round offering, all of your early round offerings, you're going to need to have an exemption from registration. And there are things that you can do where you can blow that exemption. And if you raise money and you did not have an exemption, that means you were required by federal and perhaps state law to do a registration with the Securities Exchange Commission. And in certain circumstances, we can't unring that bell. And while success kind of covers up lots of warts and blemishes. Even when you're having success, when you go to the next very, very sophisticated, very cautious institutional, they're going to do their due diligence with a fine-tooth comb, and they're going to want to know what was your exemption. How did you do this offering? And if we can't give a good answer, they won't like the bad answer. And if we can't unring that bell, then at best, it probably becomes a valuation discussion. Well, this carries with it more risk then, therefore we need to get more for our money. At worst, they walk away from the deal. And so you want to make sure that that when you're doing a round, which is really when you're raising money from other people, you're selling securities, which means there's a whole lot of laws that apply. Hopefully, your counsel can simplify those for you, because it's not as complicated when they're experienced at it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give an example of how you do an exemption? Like, what is an exemption, for example?
There's one called a 506, which is typically accredited investors, where it depends on what the type of your investors are. Sometimes it depends on the amount of dollars you're raising. 506 has an unlimited raise. And then it depends on whether you're doing a general solicitation, whether you're advertising or going beyond the group of people that you know. There's something called a 504, which, Joe, what's the 504 limit now? Is it?
5 million.
It's 5 million. It used to be 1 million. Just recently changed to 5 million. You cannot do general solicitation, but it's got limited disclosure requirements, things like that. But if you did advertising, for example, and it can be less than advertising. If you send out a mailer to a whole lot of people you don't know, and you don't have an exemption that allows you to generally solicit investment, that is, you violated the securities laws there. And it's especially if you're down the road. If we stop and let kind of a cooling off period happen, which is not what people want to do when they're out raising money, our best advice in that scenario would probably be take 6 months off, and that's not all that palatable at that point. But otherwise, if you did that and you raised money and you didn't comply with the specifics of the regs, now you're down the road and you're seeking your $5 or $10 million round, and they say, how did you do this? And we can't really fudge that. So
I think it speaks to, Chris isn't going to say it, but hire a good attorney that knows what they're doing. And you want an attorney that has experience. Not all attorneys have seen companies and advised companies through multiple stages of fundraising. And not all attorneys are created equally. So I really spend some time interviewing who's your attorney team, not, oh, hey, my buddy went to law school, I'm sure he can paper this for me.
yeah, a lot of times when we see these that were done wrong, it's there's been an attorney involved. There's lots of areas. I don't do tax law, right? So if I start giving you high level tax advice, you better ask me if I've got a colleague who might be able to help out and give a second opinion. But similarly on securities law, it's very regulatory. It's very compliance driven. So you want to get it right. Next, we have using equity as a cash substitute. We've probably both seen that. What I would say is, I've seen everywhere from almost the equivalent of paying the paper boy with equity. I've seen lease space, office space rental paid with equity. I've seen website development and marketing materials paid for with equity. That seems like it's a cheaper alternative, but if you're successful, is a much more expensive alternative. And you just have to ask yourself, anytime you're issuing equity, the question to me becomes, why is this party deserving to be in your cap table without writing you a check?
Mm-hmm. And I think early on, it's really hard to establish what's the value and what do they get in exchange. And that's why I think Chris, really pointed to, sometimes when you don't really have much, it's easy to give away more. But long term, if you're successful, that's not putting you in a good position.
Yeah.
Are there times when using equity as a cash substitute, for instance, for a strategic partner, not necessarily from a customer perspective, from a vendor perspective, that you have seen that succeed though, so that they have some sort of return on them doing a good job for you?
Sure. I would say if you can, I would still try and have them write some sort of a check. I would also have you think through how will you respond to the next institutional investor as to why you are willing to do that? Articulate, listen to yourself, does it make sense? Sometimes, for example, you may have somebody who's going to provide you with a book or a couple of years of sales, right? They're gonna buy your product, or maybe they're a paid beta or something like that. There might be some reason there. You just wanna think long and hard about it. And I'd rather see them write some sort of a check as opposed to no check. But just see if you can articulate it, if it's persuasive to you, then it may be persuasive to your next investor. What I've just too often seen that, gosh, I could pay them, but money's real tight right now. And so I'll just, it's like passing out Skittles to little kids, here you go. And then they're in your cap table and they're there forever. Next one's probably more for Charisse.
So in the fundraising world, there's a lot of emphasis put on your pitch, right? Get your pitch right, practice your pitch, make a beautiful pitch deck. The pitch will only get you so far. It'll get you in the door. It will help guide the conversations. But if you don't have a solid business behind the pitch isn't going to get you the money.
You have to have the good pitch, and the good pitch will I'm one of these people who's a sucker for a good pitch, right? And I do angel investing, so I'll hear, and if it's a space I don't know, I'm like, wow, that is really cool. This perpetual motion machine, that's gonna work, but even I, at that low level of sophistication on particular companies, will then go validate, right? So if you've got a good pitch with a bad plan, or when I co-invest with some trusted friends and cohorts, we all have different skill sets, and it's fascinating when you get, and that's only about 5 or 6 people. You get those 5 or 6 people in a room talking about a company that one thinks is awesome because they had a great pitch. The other person says, yeah, but it's going to fall flat because of A, B, or C. So you got to have a good substance behind it.
Mm-hmm. I think being able to speak to the substance is also important. I've seen some entrepreneurs get so comfortable with their 10 slides, but you ask them a question, you start to dig in, and they can't talk about their business. They can give you the sales pitch, but they don't know their business. So knowing your numbers, knowing how you're going to execute beyond getting the money will help you be more successful.
Practice that pitch with somebody who asks harder questions. I mean, I can give you a name. One of our speakers later today, I'm not sure when he'll get here, but Sheldon Oringer asks very fair but very pointed questions. And I've not ever heard him ask a question that I thought was out of bounds or mean-spirited or anything like that. But I've heard some people flounder really badly on really basic questions. The ones that you just know if they're not asked, they should be asked. So be ready.
Mm-hmm.
Next one, probably a Charisse issue as well.
And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I've seen too many companies run out of money because they just didn't realize how long it was going to take to raise capital. And I think the other mistake is the process piece of you have to be really kind of tight in your messaging and your approach and your follow-up when you're raising money. It truly is a process in how you ask for the yes or no and don't get strung along by maybes, for 12 months. How you manage the follow-up with investors. How you manage through due diligence. I've also seen where you get a term sheet and you think you're done. You have to manage the process to the close.
Yeah, you haven't raised the money until you've cashed the checks too, right? You hear Iowa Nice thrown out a lot, and you will get, in Iowa, you'll get a lot of people that are really excited about your idea, but have no intention of writing a check. And you've got to filter your way through that, and you can't save any spaces for people, right? If you've got a target, both in terms of timeline and in terms of dollars, you got to get there. And if you're able to be selective, wonderful. If you're able to get to the end and say, we could either be oversubscribed and raise more money, think about that long and hard before you do it, figure out why you should. Or you can select between the investors that you've got. You've got the legal authority to do that. But again, It always takes time, and early on, it might feel like sort of verbal traction, but when it comes time to writing checks, you will not have 100% success.
The next one, we spoke on it a little bit in talking about the pitch deck, but really not understanding your company and being clueless around your financials. You might not be a CFO, but you need to understand the basics of how many customers does it take to get to profitability? What are some of your expenses? Can you explain your financial projections? You may partner with a CFO or someone in your team who's preparing those financials, but you need to be able to talk to them and really understand them. And as an investor investing in you, they want to understand that you're going to be a good steward of their money. So understanding the finance piece is critical.
If there's an item on your financials that you can't explain, or that you say, oh, I think maybe my CFO or my accountant or somebody made a mistake, that is not acceptable. And it can take a good pitch right to the crickets moment, and it's awkward. It's not acceptable. I wrote an article one time in the Register that was called "You're an Owner Now, Act Like One." It's just got a bunch of items, and one of the reasons I wrote that is I had experienced a situation where a small business had run out of money. They outspent their means, and it was two owners, and one of the owners who I represented, said, well, our CFO didn't keep us posted. He should have let us know. You're an owner, it's a small business, and you got the financials. You better know if you're out of money. And so, and that's an extreme example. But there's just some things that you have to understand. You don't have to be a software coder, but you have to understand the basic functionality of your software if you're a technology company.
I think also being able to articulate, what are you doing with the money? What are you going to accomplish? What are those key milestones? It's sometimes easy to talk about the product and talk about the technology and your customer base. But an investor really wants to know, okay, so what's your financial plan? What are you going to do with these funds? And can you pitch them on it? Is it believable? And part of it, I think, being believable is actually truly understanding your financials.
And just maybe a final point on that. Don't be thrown off if a sophisticated investor has a different opinion on how much you should be raising and how far it will get you. That's okay. Oftentimes, the more sophisticated ones say, no, you need more money. That's a welcome discussion. They might say, I don't see why you need this much money. They might say, what's your next round going to look like? Those are all fair questions. You just want to anticipate those questions. Those are ones that are predictable. Next item is picking the wrong investors, and we probably both have thoughts on that as well. I made the comment earlier about the non-micro VC that goes down market and invests at an earlier stage and doesn't really get it. I'm not suggesting that all of them are that way, but you want to do whatever diligence you can on your investors, particularly your larger investors. Talk to other companies they've invested in. Talk to other people who've been on boards with them. Find out what their style is. Talk to them, of course, but there's the dating and there's the marriage, and so you want to make sure that they match up. And there's certain investors or certain classes of investors that come with a certain amount of pain and angst that you may not need, and if you don't need it, don't do it. On the flip side, there's some efficiency of having 5 larger investors versus 120 small investors, because you might have a really small investor who wants to call you every day or every week, and you don't want that investor.
I would also say, think through how you're going to work with them. Like if you're sitting across the table and you don't like them the first time you meet, I would highly advise don't take their money, because you're going to be with them for at least the next 3 to 5 years. And there's nothing worse than working with someone that you don't want to be working with. If you don't respect their opinion, if you don't respect maybe their take on the market. I've seen it a lot where an investor has one perspective, the entrepreneur has the other, and they spend so much of their their energy butting heads, and that doesn't make for a successful company. So do your due diligence, not only in how they've worked with entrepreneurs, but what's your style? Is it going to be an investor that you're going to work well with? Are you going to resonate with the advice that they give you? Do you have a very different perspective in how the company's going to be successful? If they have one vision for how they think you're going to be successful that doesn't match with your vision, that's likely going to cause conflict throughout the journey together, and you want to avoid that if possible.
Next one, you want to take the lead on the next one?
Sure. I think this is kind of a summarizing of a lot of the things that we've
Right.
already said, but it's okay to have weaknesses going into these pitches, going into taking on capital. You don't have to have everything figured out. I recall a couple times where an investor said, well, how are you going to do X, Y, Z? And the answer was we weren't sure. We needed time to figure that out, and that was part of the reason we were raising capital. That was part of the reason why we were looking for a certain type of investor. So it's okay to talk through where your weaknesses are, and not be ashamed of that. But it's also, know where you're strong. Know where your sweet spot is.
Yeah, and the weaknesses could be at kind of the founder or team level. And there might be a reason that right now, depending on what stage you are, for example, you can turn off investors just as fast by having a full-time paid CFO at a stage where you shouldn't, right? You're writing a big check every month. You maybe should outsource that, but you want to have a plan for that. It might be if you're a tech person, are you a CEO? Or is there a point in time where you say, I'm CEO now, but I get it. There's going to come a point where I need a different CEO. That's a common theme. The other thing is on the at the company level, you may have these weaknesses that you're vetting out, and those might not be weaknesses at all. They're just kind of variables to prove or disprove. But you're going to get, the other thing I'll tell you is especially if you're pitching investors, if you're getting consistent feedback, then that's probably something you need to address now. And there are certain companies, especially locally, a lot of people know the players in Iowa, for example. And there are companies that I know that sort of turn up every 6 months to 2 years with the same concept and the same weaknesses, and they haven't addressed it, and everybody, I don't know if they don't know it or they just haven't listened, because everybody talks about, well, if they would do this or that, they might be investable. But if you're not listening, you're hearing the same feedback, then you're probably banging your head against a wall.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a little bit about the team makeup, and when we went through the stages sheet, there's some more insight around typically what investors are looking for at what stage. I think it's also important to know, like Chris said, when you're a seed stage company, you don't need a full-time CFO, likely. So it's what's good enough for the stage that you're at, because it costs money to have lots of team members full-time. So what's absolutely the bare essential team that you need to be successful at that stage in the company? And it's going to be different when you're a seed company than in your A, B rounds. The team makeup is going to need to get more sophisticated.
And I look at the team kind of broadly, depending on which conversation I'm having, but you've got your kind of founder and management level team. And then you've got your board of directors. And then you hear a lot, I was going to comment on this earlier, you hear a lot about advisory boards. The one thing I would say about advisory boards is if you're going to use that label, is it real? Because I tell you what, I get really turned off when people say, this is my advisory board, and then I ask somebody on that advisory board about the client or the company, and they're like, yeah, I don't really know those. Or worse yet, I didn't know they were saying I'm on. I've heard that. I've been listed on an advisory board before, but I wasn't on such a board. So if you have an advisory board, which I think is conceptually a great idea, if you're using them in that way and they're providing that level of input. And the other thing is your team also, in my mind, includes those outside consultants. They can be the most expensive team members, but also they can drive value for you. They can also add some credibility as well. So.
Mm-hmm. I think Sheldon will probably talk to this later this afternoon, but a lot of investors base their investment on, do they think it's the team that can execute? So it might be a great idea, it might be a great market opportunity, but do they believe that that team has what it takes?
It's not that infrequent that somebody, especially at the angel stage, will make an investment far more based on the team than the product or the offering. You know, there's times, as I mentioned before, I'll listen to certain pitches by certain people that I know really well that have a track record of success. And my initial reaction will almost always be positive, even if I'm thinking, I should find out what that means. Wonder how that works. But if the team has executed and succeeded in the past, I'm gonna be more inclined to say they're probably gonna do it again. That's kind of the end of our mistakes slide. Anybody have any questions or comments on those?
So one of the things that I've found is that a lot of people are, not a lot, I'll come across a certain advisor who wants to be an advisor just because they think it's an easy way to get some free equity. And I've approached people about being mentors, advisors, back in Boston, not here. And very quickly they're like, well, what's the financial incentive for me? Any kind of rules of thumb in terms of how much, or whether that's a flag or something like that?
Personally, it's a flag to me. I believe there's been a lot of people that have helped me throughout my life be successful, and those people have done it because they believed in me or they believed in the idea and they were willing to do it to be successful, and they weren't taking a piece of the pie. I think there's a difference between advisors that their business is maybe being a CPA, being an accountant. I do consulting for startups, but I'm very clear about what I get paid for. Chris is very clear about what he gets paid for. JD advises. Sometimes he does that, knowing that there's a longer relationship there, but there's a paid piece. I think when someone is asking for equity in their company because they're so smart that they're going to add all this value is a huge red flag. Huge red flag.
Yeah, and it's kind of what's your ask, what's their ask, right? If you're saying, hey, maybe once a month or once a quarter we could grab a beer or a cup of coffee and you can just tell me what you think. There shouldn't be any fee for that. There shouldn't be any equity for that, right? Maybe it's somebody. Iowa and the Midwest tend to be pretty easy places to network, and some of the best value you can get from people is a warm, targeted, valuable introduction. There's no equity piece for that. You know, that's unreasonable. If you're saying, I want you to be on my advisory board or on my board of directors and I want you to attend a 2-hour meeting every week, that's a pretty big commitment. Now, then the other thing you would look at is should that be equity? Should that be a meeting fee? I don't know that there's any one size fits all, but I agree with Charisse that ask based on, hey, I think you could help me with some ideas. It's a red flag in my mind.
It gets fuzzy. So like, what's they're getting equity for what? For a year of advisement, 10 years of advisement? I mean, your company might be around for a long time, so that could be really expensive equity that you're giving up, and there's no clarity on what they're actually providing you. Like in board, typically, and if you have a counter to this, I'd love to hear it. Most board members in the venture capital world don't get paid.
Yeah.
At times they might get some stock options if it really makes sense and you've matured to that point, but they're typically unpaid board members.
And you know what? You issue that stock and then they stop helping. You know, it's then you have that to explain to everybody who invests after that. So.
Yeah.
I actually had the opposite issue where I have a founder who wants some key industry partners all up and down the channel, make it vertically integrated, and he just said, well, I think they should get 2%. I think we should put together that group. And my advice is, I'm more worried about stranded investors that are just dead weight, like you're saying. Is there a reasonable percentage that I should tell him, yes, we could think about? Because he's been asking everything from, I said, well, maybe a pool of 10% for everybody, and you carve that out, or is stranded investors a real issue with that?
Well, if you think about it, the typical carve out for a pool is your employees, right? Your option.
Right.
Those are the people that are vested every day and contributing to the value of your company every day. and they've got, I used the word vested, but they've got vesting requirements, right? So they don't just get a free ride, free equity. Industry kind of channels or strategic relationships, I have not ever seen a pool carved out for them, and I would resist it.
Okay, that's what I've been doing.
Yes.
Got any advice on equity over time? So we start sort of technology-driven startups, and you know, you need people in at different stages and for different amounts of time and maybe different amounts of their effort. So we're struggling with how to evolve over a few years.
And these would be employees?
No, these are founder-owned.
Okay. If you're going to be required by a VC to vest into your founder's stock, which certainly happens, I think you're gonna probably want that to be a 2-3 year kind of at the top end, and I would, it kind of depends on which hat I'm wearing, right? So I've represented both sides of the argument here, but if I'm a founder, I've already come up with the idea, I've already brought you into the deal, I want to resist that as much as I can, having to vest into my own ownership, but yet if I haven't written big checks, you know, and I would want it to be periodic vesting, not what they call cliff vesting, so I don't have to get to the end of 3 years where it all vests. I want it to vest over time, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Or even, you can cut that into smaller increments too. But I don't want to be the founder who gets 2.5 years out and gets blown out of the company by my investors and has very little to show for it. I'd at least want to walk away from that with some substantial equity.
Mhm.